Eleanor Whitfield had never been the sort of woman to apologize for taking what she wanted, and on the crowded platform of the Cheyenne Depot that autumn morning, what she wanted was a seat by the window, away from the crush of travelers and the smell of coal smoke, where she could watch the planes roll past in peace and pretend, for a few hours at least, that her husband's death 18 months prior hadn't left her rattling around a mansion too large for one woman and her memories. She had dressed carefully that morning, as she dressed every morning, in deep mourning purple that had softened over the months into something closer to the color of a bruise healing, and she had arrived early enough, she believed, to claim her pick of seats before the second-class rabble came pushing through with their trunks and their children and their noise. So when she stepped into the carriage and saw the empty bench by the window, cushioned and clean and catching the best of the morning light, she sat herself down without a second thought, arranged her skirts, and opened her book, entirely unaware that she had just taken a seat that had, 5 minutes earlier, belonged to someone else. Daniel Coleman had gone to fetch his daughter a cup of water from the platform vendor, a small enough errand, and had left his hat on the seat beside his valise to mark it as taken, the way any reasonable person would understand. He returned to find his hat sitting in the aisle where it had apparently been moved, his valise shoved beneath the bench, and a striking, sharp-featured woman in an elaborate purple dress occupying the exact spot where his daughter Grace had been sitting only minutes before, now standing awkwardly in the aisle clutching her worn teddy bear, uncertain what to do about the fact that a grown woman was sitting where she had been. Daniel felt his temper flare, the particular hot, protective anger of a father whose child has been displaced and is too young and too polite to say so, and he opened his mouth to say something sharp about manners and other people's belongings, but something in the woman's face stopped him. She looked up at him with an expression that wasn't haughty exactly, though there was pride in it, but rather the look of someone bracing for a confrontation she half expected and didn't particularly want. "I believe," Daniel said, keeping his voice level with some effort, "that seat was taken." "Was it?" The woman glanced down at the space around her as though searching for evidence, found none, and looked back up at him with the faintest lift of one eyebrow. "I saw no marker. No coat, no bag, nothing to suggest it belonged to anyone." "My hat was on it." "Your hat," she repeated, "was in the aisle, sir, where I found it after I sat down, and where I assume it fell rather than having been deliberately placed to reserve a seat for a man who had, by all appearances, abandoned it entirely." Grace, who was 7 years old and had inherited her father's stubborn jaw but not yet his temper, tugged at Daniel's sleeve and whispered that it was all right. She didn't mind standing, which was of course not true, but which was the kind of small brave lie that children tell when they sense the adults around them are on the verge of an argument they'd rather not witness. Daniel looked down at his daughter, then back at the woman, and felt the fight go out of him in the particular way it always did when he remembered that being right mattered a great deal less than being kind, especially with Grace watching. "It's a long ride to Prescott Junction," he said instead. "There are other seats." "There are," the woman agreed, though she made no move to find one, and something about her stillness, the way she sat with her spine perfectly straight and her hands folded over her book as though daring him to press the matter further, told Daniel that this was a woman unaccustomed to giving ground, whatever the cost. He might have walked away then, might have found 2 other seats and let the matter drop entirely, except that Grace, tired of standing and increasingly unwilling to hide her disappointment, let out a small, unhappy sound that was not quite a whimper but was close enough to one that it cut straight through Daniel's patience and, apparently, through something in the widow as well, because her expression shifted, just slightly, the pride in it giving way to something more uncertain. "How old is she?" the woman asked, nodding at Grace. "7. She looks tired. We've been traveling since yesterday. Her mother passed 8 months ago, and we're going to stay with her aunt in Prescott Junction while I sort out some business. It's been a hard trip for her." Daniel wasn't sure why he told her all that, more than she'd asked, more than a stranger deserved to know, except that something about the woman's directness seemed to invite the same in return, and he found he wanted, for reasons he couldn't have named, for her to understand that his irritation wasn't really about the seat at all. The widow's face did something complicated then, a flicker of emotion crossing it too quickly for Daniel to read clearly, though he would come to know, in the weeks that followed, that it was the particular expression she wore whenever anyone mentioned losing a spouse, a mixture of recognition and old grief that she worked very hard to keep from showing. She looked at Grace for a long moment, and then, without another word of argument, she rose from the seat, gathered her book and her small traveling bag, and stepped into the aisle. "Sit," she said. "Both of you. I'll find another place." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said a little sharply, though the sharpness seemed aimed more at herself than at him. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference, and I'd thank you not to argue with a woman who's trying to do the decent thing for once." Daniel might have let her go then, might have accepted the concession and settled Grace into the seat and thought no more of the sharp-tongued widow in purple, except that the carriage was, in fact, entirely full, every other bench occupied by families and drummers and a pair of cattlemen who took up more than their fair share of space, and it became rapidly clear, as the widow made her way down the aisle searching for an alternative, that there was nowhere else for her to sit at all. She returned a few minutes later, having circled the length of the car twice, with an expression of controlled irritation that suggested she had discovered this same fact and was not enjoying the position it put her in. "It appears," she said stiffly, "that there is nowhere else." "Then I suppose we'll have to share," Daniel said, and gestured at the bench, wide enough, if everyone sat properly, for three. It was not, Eleanor would reflect later, the way she had imagined spending the 11-hour journey to Prescott Junction, wedged between a window and a stranger's daughter, forced into a proximity with a man whose irritation with her had been entirely justified and whose graciousness afterward had left her feeling, uncomfortably, like the villain of the encounter. But there was nothing to be done about it now except endure it with whatever dignity she could muster, and so she settled back against the seat, opened her book, and attempted to read, though she found her attention wandering, again and again, to the small girl beside her, who had fallen asleep within 20 minutes of the train's departure, her head listing gradually toward Eleanor's shoulder until it came to rest there entirely. The teddy bear crushed between them. Eleanor sat very still, unwilling to disturb the child, and found herself, over the following hour, studying the pair of them with the sort of attention she generally reserved for matters of business. Daniel Coleman was, she judged, perhaps 35, with a weathered sun-browned look of a man who worked outdoors, hands roughened by labor rather than a desk, though there was an evident education in the way he spoke, careful and unhurried, that suggested he hadn't always been a rancher or whatever he was. He read to Grace when she woke, a battered dime novel that seemed entirely unsuited to a 7-year-old's temperament but which she clearly adored, doing voices for the different characters in a low murmur that made the girl giggle despite her exhaustion. He was patient with her in a way that surprised Eleanor, patient in the specific, practiced manner of someone who had been doing this alone for a while and had learned, through trial and considerable error, how to manage a grieving child without losing his own composure in the process. "You're staring," Daniel said at one point, not looking up from the book, and Eleanor felt her face heat in a way it hadn't in years. "I was reading. You haven't turned a page in 20 minutes. She had no answer for that, and so she said nothing, and turned instead to look out the window at the plane sliding past, gold and endless under the afternoon sun, and told herself firmly that whatever curiosity she felt toward this man and his daughter was nothing more than the natural interest of a long, tedious journey with little else to occupy her mind. It was a lie she managed to maintain for perhaps another hour, until Grace woke fully and, in the particular unself-conscious way of children, simply began talking to her, asking about her dress and her rings and whether she had any children of her own, and Eleanor found herself answering more honestly than she had answered anyone in months, telling the girl about the husband she'd lost, about the house that felt too big and too quiet, about the way grief settled into a person's bones and never quite left, though it did, over time, grow more bearable. "Papa's sad too," Grace said, with the blunt honesty of the very young. "He doesn't say so, but I know. He thinks I don't notice, but I notice." Daniel's jaw tightened, and Eleanor watched him decide whether to deflect the moment or let it stand, and was surprised, and quietly moved, when he chose the latter. "She's right," he said simply. "I am. I don't imagine that ever fully goes away, does it?" "No," Eleanor agreed. "It doesn't. But it does change shape. It stops being the only thing you feel." They talked more after that, cautiously at first and then with increasing ease, about small things, the ranch he was building outside Prescott Junction, The mercantile business Eleanor's late husband had left her and that she now ran herself, much to the scandalized whispers of Cheyenne society, which had strong opinions about widows who involved themselves in commerce rather than remarrying quietly and disappearing back into domestic obscurity. Daniel, she noted, did not seem scandalized in the least. If anything, he seemed impressed, asking her pointed, genuine questions about the business, about supply lines and inventory and the particular challenges of being a woman taken seriously by suppliers who preferred dealing with men, and Eleanor found herself talking more animatedly than she had in months, gesturing with her hands, forgetting entirely to maintain the careful, composed reserve she usually wore like armor. By the time the sun began its long slide toward the horizon, painting the carriage windows gold, Grace had fallen asleep again, this time against Eleanor's arm rather than her shoulder. One small hand curled loosely around the sleeve of her purple dress, and Eleanor found she did not mind the wrinkle it was surely leaving in the silk, did not mind at all the small solid warmth of the child pressed against her, a feeling she had almost forgotten, having buried any hope of children of her own. Alongside her husband, whose illness had taken not only him but the family they had spent years failing to build. She looked across at Daniel and found him watching her, not with irritation now but with something gentler, something that made her pulse do an unfamiliar, unwelcome thing. "You're good with her," he said quietly. "I've had very little practice. Doesn't show." He hesitated, then added, "She's usually wary of strangers. Since her mother, especially. It took her weeks to warm up to her own aunt. Perhaps she can tell I understand something of what she's carrying. Perhaps." Daniel studied her for a moment longer than was strictly polite, and Eleanor found she did not look away, though every instinct honed by 18 months of careful, controlled widowhood told her she ought to. "Can I ask you something forward?" "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." A small smile touched his mouth, the first real one she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face entirely, softened the weathered severity of it into something almost boyish. "Why were you traveling alone? A woman like you, I'd have expected an escort, at the very least a maid." "A woman like me," Eleanor repeated, with a dry edge. "You mean a widow with more money than sense, who ought to know better than to travel unescorted and take other people's seats." "I meant a woman who clearly doesn't need an escort to manage herself perfectly well. I meant it as a compliment, badly delivered, evidently." Eleanor considered him for a long moment, turning the question over, deciding how much of the truth she owed a stranger she'd known for less than a day. "I go to Prescott Junction 3 or 4 times a year," she said finally, "to inspect a warehouse my husband built there before he died, one of the few pieces of the business I've never quite known what to do with. I always travel alone. I find I prefer it, or I did, until this morning, when a very stubborn man refused to let me sacrifice my dignity quietly and instead insisted we share a bench for 11 hours, forcing me into more conversation than I've had with anyone since the funeral. I apologize for the inconvenience." "Don't," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the force of it. "Don't apologize. I don't think I've minded an inconvenience this much in a very long time." The words hung between them, more honest than either had intended, and Daniel's expression shifted into something careful and searching, the look of a man recalculating an entire day's assumptions in the space of a sentence. Outside, the light had gone fully golden, the plain stretching endless and glowing toward a horizon neither of them was watching anymore, and Grace slept on, oblivious, between two people who had begun the journey as strangers contesting a train seat and were ending it, 5 minutes at a time, as something else entirely, something neither had names for yet but which felt, to both of them, dangerously close to hope. They spoke of little consequence after that, the practical logistics of arrival, whether Daniel had lodging arranged, whether Eleanor's business would keep her in Prescott Junction long, but underneath the ordinary words ran a current neither acknowledged aloud, a growing awareness that stretched taut between them every time their eyes met over the sleeping child's head. When the train finally pulled into Prescott Junction well after dark, steam hissing and the platform lit by lanterns, Daniel gathered Grace gently into his arms, and Eleanor found herself reluctant, in a way that startled her, to let the moment end, to step off the train and return to her separate errand and her separate life as though the day had been nothing more than an ordinary inconvenience endured and forgotten. "I don't suppose," Daniel said, as they stood together on the platform, the crowd thinning around them, "that a woman who prefers traveling alone would consider having supper with a stubborn man and his daughter before you disappear back into your warehouse business." Eleanor looked at him, at the tired, hopeful set of his shoulders, at Grace stirring awake against his chest and blinking sleepily up at her with an expression of such open, uncomplicated affection that something in Eleanor's carefully guarded heart simply gave way, the way a dam gives way, not all at once but in a single crack that made the whole structure suddenly, inevitably vulnerable. "I suppose," she said, "that she might." They had supper that night at the small hotel dining room near the depot, and then again the following evening, and the one after that, Eleanor's business in the warehouse stretching, by unspoken mutual agreement, considerably longer than it ever had before. She wrote to her lawyer in Cheyenne asking him to manage the mercantile a while longer than planned, told herself it was simply prudent to oversee the warehouse renovations personally, and told herself the same thing again a week later, and again the week after that, until the fiction wore thin enough that even she could no longer maintain it with any seriousness. Daniel, for his part, found excuses of his own, delayed the start of construction on his new barn, invented reasons to be at the hotel dining room precisely when Eleanor was likely to be there, and by the time autumn had fully settled over the territory, gold leaves giving way to bare branches, neither of them bothered much with excuses at all. It was Grace, in the end, who said plainly what both adults had spent 2 months dancing carefully around, asking Eleanor one evening, with the same blunt honesty that had first startled her on the train, whether she might come and live with them, since she seemed to make Papa happy, and Grace herself liked her a great deal, and didn't see any reason for the 2 houses when one would clearly do. Daniel had gone red to the ears and started to apologize for his daughter's forwardness, but Eleanor, watching the earnest hope on the child's face, found she had no wish to soften the question or explain it away. "I would like that very much," she said, looking not at Grace but at Daniel, "if her father would like it too." Daniel married Eleanor Whitfield the following spring, in a small ceremony at the ranch he'd finished building over that first winter, with Grace as flower girl, scattering petals down an aisle of freshly turned earth where a garden would eventually grow, and Eleanor wore not black or mourning purple but a pale blue dress that Grace had helped select, insisting it matched her eyes. She sold the mercantile business in Cheyenne but kept the warehouse in Prescott Junction, expanded it in fact, built it into something larger and more prosperous than her late husband had ever managed, running it now from a home filled with noise and laughter and a stepdaughter who called her mama within the first year, without prompting, simply because it felt true. Years later, when people asked how the rancher and the wealthy widow had come to marry, Daniel would tell the story of the train seat with a wry, fond smile, how his daughter had lost her place to a stranger in purple silk, how his temper had flared and then, within 5 minutes, had turned into something he'd never expected to feel again, and Eleanor would always finish the telling the same way, insisting that it hadn't taken 5 minutes at all, only the moment she'd looked up and seen a tired little girl's hand curled trustingly around her sleeve, and understood, with a certainty that frightened and delighted her in equal measure, that she had found, quite by accident, exactly what she hadn't known she was looking for.